Her body was shaking. Not like she was cold, no. It was a deeper tremor, a vibration from the soul, as if life itself was getting ready to pack up and leave. She stood barefoot on the muddy bank of the river, the thick, brown water swirling just inches from her toes. A torn white cloth was all she had, and it clung to her skin like a second, ghostly layer of herself. Her cheek was a swollen mess of red and purple. Her knees were raw, scraped down to the bone from being dragged. And on her hip there was a fresh burn, an iron brand seared so deep into her flesh that the smell of it, the sickening scent of scorched meat, still hung in the heavy afternoon air. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky above. The river just kept rolling on, steady and indifferent. She tried to take a step, just one, to get away from the water's edge, but her legs were having none of it. They buckled and she fell hard onto her knees in the mud. Her voice, when it came out, was a fractured whisper. "Please," she begged to the empty air, "don't lift it." It was a plea torn right down the middle, half shame, half raw terror. Her name was Eliza Hart, and she had seen something she was never ever supposed to see. That morning she'd been working at the ferry landing, a place of loud noises and hurried men, washing plates and hauling buckets of greasy water. And that's where she saw him, Mace Carver, a man who used to be a trusted hand on the Bar H ranch, now moving with a snake's quiet confidence. He was switching out prime cattle for scrawny ones, his pen scratching across false bills of sale in the dim light of the stockyard office. Eliza knew what it meant. Theft, plain and simple. When she told him she was going to the sheriff, his eyes didn't get angry. They just went dead, like two stones at the bottom of a well. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed her. He and his partner, a lanky shadow of a man named Sloan, dragged her behind the stockyard where no one could hear. They stripped away her dignity with their fists and their heavy boots, leaving her gasping in the dust. And then, as if the beating wasn't enough, Mace pulled a branding iron from the fire. But it wasn't just any brand. It was the Bar H. Cole Harding's brand, a mark of honor in this valley. Mace had taken a file to it, though. He'd reversed the H, a cruel, twisted little trap designed to ruin another man's name, to frame him for something this vile. Mace was ready to finish it. He twisted a rope around her neck, his knuckles white as he pulled it tight. But just as her vision started to speckle and fade, the ferry bell rang out, loud and clear from the river. Voices, laughing and talking, drifted down the trail. Killing her now would be too risky. Too many eyes, too many questions. He cursed, a low, guttural sound. He pulled the rope free and, with Sloane's help, heaved her into the tall reeds by the riverbank. "Let the sun and the river finish her," he muttered, and then they were gone. Hours crawled by. Each breath Eliza took was a shallow, painful task. The sky above was a blurry, burning white. Every snap of a twig, every distant sound of hooves on the trail sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. She was starting to think death had already come and was just taking its sweet time. Then a shadow fell across her face, a long, cool shadow that blocked out the sun. Cole Harding reined his horse in at the water's edge. He was 54 years old, his clothes were pressed neat, and a clean red scarf was tied at his neck. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was just a man on his way to Dry Creek, stopping to water his horse. But instead of a quiet moment by the river, he found a broken girl clinging to the last threads of her life. Her body was wrapped in tatters, and her eyes were wide with a plea that needed no words. He swung down from his horse, his knees popping as he crouched beside her. He untied the scarf from his neck and gently pressed it against the gash on her head. Her skin was hot, burning with fever. "Please," she whispered again, her hand weakly trying to hold the torn cloth over her hip. "Don't lift it." Cole hesitated, but he had to know the extent of the damage. He had to know what he was dealing with. He gently lifted the edge of the cloth, and then he froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. Staring back at him, seared into her skin, was the mark of his own ranch. The Bar H twisted, backward. A vile accusation burned into human flesh. Cole felt a cold dread creep up his spine. This wasn't a random act of cruelty. This was personal. This was a message. Why would a man go to the trouble of stealing a branding iron, filing it backward, and then burning a woman with it? What kind of secret was worth this level of brutality? And more importantly, who hated him enough to do it? He didn't waste another second. He lifted the girl into his arms. She was as light as a bundle of dry sticks, her skin radiating heat. He laid her carefully across his saddle, holding her steady as the horse picked its way up the trail to a small line shack he kept hidden in the pines. Inside the cabin, the air was cool and smelled of old wood smoke and pine needles. He laid her on the simple cot in the corner and poured some water from a canteen into a tin cup. She drank it slowly, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the cup. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Eliza," she whispered. It was a raw, broken sound. Her eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen the absolute worst of men. Cole took a clean rag and began to clean the wound on her side. The sight of that backward brand seemed to burn itself into his mind. It was his mark, his reputation, twisted into something ugly and hateful. Someone wanted him ruined. And Cole had lived long enough in this part of the country to know how fast a vicious rumor could turn into a lynch mob. Eliza's story came out in fits and starts, broken by shudders and long silences. She told him everything. Mace Carver, the ferry landing, the switched cattle and the false bills of sale. She told him how she'd threatened to go to the sheriff and how Mace and Sloan had dragged her away. They beat her, she said, until she couldn't even see straight. And then they heated that iron. Her voice cracked on the last words, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "They wanted folks to think you did it," she whispered, looking at him with those wide, terrified eyes. They wanted everyone to believe Cole Harding was a monster. Cole sat back on the small wooden stool, the floorboards creaking under his weight. Mace Carver. The name tasted like rust in his mouth. Mace had worked for him a few years back. He was a hard worker, but there was a mean streak in him, a darkness that Cole didn't trust. Cole had fired him after catching him shortchanging the herd count one too many times. He thought that was the end of it. Now it was clear Mace had been holding on to that grudge, letting it fester into this poisonous plan for revenge. Just as the thought crossed his mind, a sharp knock came at the cabin door. Cole's hand instantly went to the old shotgun propped against the wall. He moved silently to the door, peering through a crack in the wood. But it wasn't Mace Carver. It was Jasper Finn, the town blacksmith, his face red and beaded with sweat. "Cole?" Jasper called out, his voice laced with worry. "You in there?" Cole opened the door. Jasper wiped his brow with the back of a calloused hand. "Cole, thank goodness. Have you seen my big branding iron? The Bar H one you asked me to repair?" Cole's blood ran cold. "When did you last see it, Jasper?" "It was there last night when I closed up shop. Gone this morning. And my fire pit, it shows fresh ash. Someone used my forge in the middle of the night." The pieces didn't just click together. They slammed together with the force of a locomotive. Eliza, burned with his brand. Jasper's missing, freshly used iron. The crooked cattle deal. This wasn't just revenge. This was a carefully laid trap, and he and this girl were caught right in the middle of it. Eliza's eyes searched his face, desperate for some sign of hope, some promise that this nightmare would end. "You're safe here," Cole said, his voice more certain than he felt. "As long as you stay under this roof, nobody's going to touch you." But they both knew it was a lie. A door latch and a few wooden planks wouldn't stop a man like Mace Carver. He'd left a job unfinished. And a man like that always comes back to finish what he started. The shadows were growing long when Cole saddled his horse again. The line shack was too exposed, too isolated. Their only real chance was to make it to Dry Creek, to the law. He helped Eliza onto the horse, settling her behind him and wrapping a thick wool blanket around her shivering shoulders. Her face was still pale, a ghostly white in the fading light, but her eyes were steady now. There was a flicker of fight in them. The trail was quiet at first. The only sounds were the soft thud of hooves on the dirt path and the rhythmic creak of the saddle leather. It was a peaceful sound, but it did nothing to calm the tension coiled in Cole's gut. Halfway to Dry Creek, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. It was an old instinct, honed by years of living in a land that was beautiful, but never truly safe. He knew, without knowing how he knew, that they were being watched. Then they appeared. Two riders on the ridge ahead, silhouetted against the bruised purple and orange of the sunset. Mace Carver and Sloane Avery. They guided their horses down the rocky slope with a lazy, arrogant slowness, moving to block the path. A smug grin was plastered on Mace's face, a grin that made the blood in Cole's veins turn to ice. "Well now," Mace called out, his voice dripping with false cheer. "Looks like old man Harding picked up some stray cattle he shouldn't have." Cole didn't answer. He simply shifted in the saddle, placing his body squarely between Eliza and the two men. His hand rested on the double-barreled shotgun lying across his thigh. The barrels were pointed at the dust, but the message was as clear as a gunshot in a silent church. "Step aside, Mace," Cole said. His voice carried no tremble, no fear, just a tired, unbendable kind of steel. Sloane, younger and dumber, laughed, a high-pitched, nervous sound. His hand started to move toward the revolver holstered at his hip. In the same split second, Cole raised the shotgun and pulled one trigger. The blast echoed through the valley, a deafening roar. He hadn't aimed at the men. He'd aimed at the ground right in front of Sloane's horse. Dust and pebbles exploded into the air. The horse screamed and reared, and Sloane yelled, cursing as he fought to stay in the saddle. Eliza gasped behind Cole, her hands tightening on his shirt. But Cole didn't flinch. He just sat there, solid as an old oak tree, his finger still resting on the second trigger. "You want her?" Cole said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You'll have to come through me first." The moment stretched, thick and heavy. The river murmured somewhere in the distance. Even the birds in the trees seemed to have gone silent, holding their breath. Mace sneered, his eyes darting from Cole's face to the remaining barrel of the shotgun. He was a brute, but he wasn't a fool. He knew Cole Harding wasn't a man who made idle threats. He had one shot left, and a hand steady enough to use it. "Come on," Mace barked at Sloane, yanking his own horse's reins. "This ain't the time, or the place." As they wheeled their horses around to leave, Sloane was still fumbling with his spooked mount. His gun belt, loosened in the chaos, slipped. A heavy silver buckle fell from it, landing in the dirt with a soft thud. It lay there, winking in the last rays of sunlight. Cole's eyes locked onto it. It was proof. Cold, hard, shining proof right there in the dust. When the sound of their horses had faded into the distance, Cole swung down from his saddle. He walked over and picked up the buckle. It was heavy, made of solid silver, with a crudely engraved M on the front. Eliza leaned forward, her eyes wide. "That's his," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That's Mace's buckle. I saw it." Cole didn't say anything. He just tucked it safely into his saddlebag. He knew this changed everything. Now, he didn't just have a terrified girl's word against a known troublemaker. He had a piece of physical evidence, a direct link between Mace Carver and the scene of the confrontation. The rest of the ride to town was silent, but Cole's mind was racing. The encounter on the trail wasn't just a chance meeting. They had been waiting for them, which meant they knew he'd found Eliza. They knew he was taking her to town. But how? Was someone watching the line shack? Or was there a traitor in Dry Creek, someone feeding them information? He had one barrel left in his shotgun, one silver buckle in his bag, and 100 questions with no answers. The storm wasn't over. It was only just beginning. They didn't ride straight into town. Cole was too cautious for that. He found a sheltered spot in the hills just outside the town limits, and they waited for dawn. As the first light spilled over the landscape, painting the sky in shades of gray and rose, they rode into Dry Creek. The town was just starting to wake up. Shopkeepers were sweeping their boardwalks, and the first wagons of the day were rattling down the main street. As Cole guided his horse down the dusty road, with Eliza sitting close behind him, wrapped in the blanket, heads began to turn. People stopped what they were doing. They stared. Whispers followed them like a swarm of angry bees, low and sharp and full of suspicion. Cole kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. He'd lived in this town his whole life. He knew that a rumor in a place like Dry Creek could travel faster and do more damage than a prairie fire. Their first stop was the doctor's office. Doc Miller was an old man with kind eyes and gentle hands. He treated Eliza with a quiet, professional care. cleaning her wounds and wrapping them in fresh white bandages. He shook his head at the cruelty of the brand. But when he was done, he gave Cole a small, reassuring smile. "She'll heal," he said, his voice low. "The flesh will anyway. She's tougher than she looks." Cole waited on the porch, his hat in his hands, the weight of the silver buckle in his saddlebag feeling heavier than a bar of gold. It wasn't just a piece of metal anymore. It was a key. It was proof that this wasn't about him being a monster. It was about someone else wanting the world to think he was. As he waited, he saw a familiar, soot-stained figure striding up the street. It was Jasper Finn. "Cole!" the blacksmith called out, his face grim. "I've got something you need to see. Now!" Cole followed him around to the back of the blacksmith shop, to a weathered hay shed that leaned tiredly to one side. Jasper kicked aside a pile of loose straw, and there it was. Hidden beneath the hay was the missing branding iron. Its edges were blackened with fresh ash and soot. The H was clearly filed backward, a tool of honor, twisted into a weapon of lies. Cole wrapped it carefully in an old piece of burlap, his jaw clenched tight. "Will you swear in front of the sheriff this is yours, Jasper? That it was stolen from your forge?" Jasper met his eyes without a flicker of hesitation. "Stolen from me 2 nights ago. I'll swear it on a stack of Bibles." The two men didn't waste any more time. They carried the iron straight to the office of Sheriff Amos Reed. The sheriff was a big man, slow-moving, but with sharp, intelligent eyes. He listened patiently, his gaze shifting from the backward iron to the silver buckle, to Eliza's pale but determined face. He let her tell her story, from beginning to end, without a single interruption. Each word she spoke seemed to land with the solid thud of a nail being hammered into a coffin. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the small, dusty office. Sheriff Reed leaned back in his creaky wooden chair, steepling his fingers under his chin. He looked at Cole. "This is enough," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The girl's word, the blacksmith's oath, this buckle, the iron itself. It all points one way, straight to Mace Carver." He stood up, the chair groaning in protest, and lifted his rifle from the rack on the wall. "He won't walk free another day." A wave of relief washed over Cole, but it was short-lived. The law was one thing, a piece of paper and a badge. Justice out on the open range was another thing entirely. Mace Carver had already shown how far he was willing to go. He wasn't the type to surrender peacefully. On the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office, under the harsh morning sun, Eliza gently touched Cole's arm. Her eyes, no longer filled with just terror, searched his face. "You believe me?" she asked, the question soft but heavy with meaning. "You really believe me?" Cole looked down at the young woman he had found broken by the river. He saw not just a victim, but a survivor. His reply came quiet, but with the certainty of bedrock. "I always did." The sheriff began gathering a posse. Men started saddling up in the street, checking their rifles, their faces grim. But Cole didn't join them. He stayed right there, close to Eliza. He knew his duty wasn't to go chasing Mace Carver through the canyons and ravines. His duty was to keep this girl safe, to see this through to the very end. But as he watched the posse ride out of town, kicking up a cloud of dust, one thought gnawed at him. The confrontation on the trail proved Mace knew their plans. What if he knew the posse was coming? What if it was another trap? And what if, while the sheriff and his men were chasing shadows in the hills, Mace decided to double back? What if he came back to Dry Creek to finish the one loose end that could unravel his whole scheme? The one person who saw what he did. Eliza. The days that followed were a strange kind of calm. It was the quiet at the center of a storm. Eliza rested at the small boarding house Doc Miller had found for her, while Cole kept a constant, quiet watch from a chair on the porch across the street. The sheriff's posse had ridden out with a lot of noise and confidence, but Cole stayed behind. He had nothing left to prove to the men of this town. All that mattered now was the life of the young woman who was slowly, piece by piece, coming back to herself. By the second week, she was stronger. She started helping the boarding house owner with small chores, fetching water from the well, sweeping the floors. Her laughter, when it first came, was a soft, hesitant sound, almost like she was afraid to let it out. But each day it grew a little steadier, a little more confident. Cole found himself listening for it, a sound that cut through the constant tension that had settled over him. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the clouds in fiery colors, he walked with her. They went down to the same stretch of river where he had first found her. The light was soft now, turning the muddy water to gold. Cole carried his old worn coat over his arm. When the evening chill began to set in, he placed it gently around her shoulders. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the gentle murmur of the river and the buzzing of the cicadas in the cottonwood trees. It was Eliza who finally broke the silence. "You could have walked away that day," she said, her voice soft. "You could have ridden on by. You had no reason to stop, no reason to get involved." Cole looked out over the current, his weathered face lined with the years of hard sun and harder living. "Sometimes a man doesn't need a reason," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Sometimes he just knows what's right." Her eyes shone in the fading light. He saw something in them he hadn't seen before. Not fear, not gratitude. It was hope. For the first time since her nightmare began, she was letting herself believe in the possibility of a tomorrow. But as they stood there, a sudden movement on the far bank caught Cole's eye. A single rider, sitting on his horse, partially hidden in the shadows of the trees. He was too far away to make out his features, but he was just sitting there, watching them. The quiet moment was shattered. The calm was broken. Mace Carver hadn't been caught, and he hadn't run. He was here. He was watching, and he was waiting. The posse had been a fool's errand, a wild goose chase designed to get the law out of town. And now they were alone. Cole got Eliza back to the boarding house without a word, his hand resting on the Colt at his hip the entire way. He didn't tell her what he'd seen. There was no need to put that fear back in her eyes. But he knew. The game had changed. This wasn't about waiting for the law anymore. This was about survival. That night, Cole didn't sleep. He sat in the darkness of his own small room at the hotel, the shotgun across his lap, watching the street below. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Around midnight, he saw it. A flicker of orange light from the direction of the blacksmith shop. Then another. The light grew, turning the night sky a sick, pulsing red. Fire. Cole was out the door in a second, his boots pounding on the wooden boardwalk. By the time he reached the blacksmith shop, the whole building was engulfed in flames. Men were shouting, throwing buckets of water that seemed to hiss and disappear into the inferno. Jasper Finn stood there, his face black with soot, his eyes wide with horror, watching his entire life turn to ash. "He did this," Jasper choked out, grabbing Cole's arm. "Mace Carver. He came back. He said this was a warning, for talking to you, for helping you." The fire wasn't just about destroying a building. It was another message. A message to the whole town. Help Cole Harding, and you will burn. The fear was palpable. You could smell it in the air, mixing with the smoke. Men who had been ready to join a posse a week ago were now looking at Cole with suspicion, with fear. They were backing away. The fire had done its job. It had isolated him. The next morning, Sheriff Reed and his exhausted posse rode back into town. They were empty-handed. They'd found tracks, a few cold campsites, but Mace had vanished like a ghost in the hills. When Cole told him about the fire, about Jasper's warning, the sheriff's face went grim. But then he did something strange. He looked away. "I can't prove Mace started that fire, Cole," he said, his voice flat. "I need more than a scared man's word." Cole couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You have the brand. You have the buckle. You have Eliza's testimony." "It's not enough," Reed said, his voice sharp. "Not anymore. People are scared. The town council is putting pressure on me. They want this to go away. They think you're the one bringing all this trouble down on us." And that was the second twist of the knife. Mace wasn't just trying to frame him. He was turning the whole town against him. He was making Cole the villain, the source of all the fear and violence. He was making it so that even if the truth came out, nobody would be willing to stand with him. Cole looked at the sheriff, a man he'd known for 20 years, and he saw a stranger. He saw a man who was choosing the easy path over the right one. He was on his own. He and Eliza against everyone. That afternoon, Cole went to the livery stable to check on his horse. The stable hand, a young kid named Billy, usually talked his ear off. Today, he wouldn't even meet Cole's eyes. He just did his work, silent and sullen. As Cole was leaving, Billy finally spoke, his voice so low it was barely a whisper. "Mr. Harding," he said, still not looking up, "there's a man been asking about you. Big fella, wears a fancy suit. Name's Thorne. Silas Thorne." Silas Thorne. The name hit Cole like a physical blow. Thorne was a rival rancher from the next valley over, a ruthless, ambitious man who had been trying to buy up land around Dry Creek for years. He wanted water rights, and Cole's Bar H Ranch had the best springs in the county. Cole had refused to sell to him, time and time again. "What did Thorne want?" Cole asked, his voice tight. "He was asking about your herd," Billy mumbled, "and about your finances. He was talking to Mr. Abernathy at the bank." The trap was suddenly much bigger and much more complex than simple revenge. Mace Carver wasn't the mastermind. He was just a pawn, a hired thug. The real player, the man pulling all the strings, was Silas Thorne. Thorne wanted his land. He couldn't buy it, so he was trying to take it. First, by ruining Cole's reputation with the branding, forcing a scandal that might make him sell cheap. When that didn't work, he was using Mace to terrorize the town, to isolate Cole, to make him an outcast. It was a classic land grab, dressed up in violence and deceit. The cattle rustling Eliza had seen wasn't just about a few extra dollars for Mace. It was about systematically weakening the Bar H, creating false records to dispute Cole's ownership claims. The whole thing was a siege. And it was working. Cole went straight to the bank. Mr. Abernathy was a small, nervous man with glasses perched on the end of his nose. At first, he denied everything. But when Cole pressed him, his composure cracked. "He holds the notes on half the businesses in this town, Cole," Abernathy confessed, his voice trembling. "Including this bank. Thorne can ruin us all with the stroke of a pen. He told me to find a reason to call in your loan. The whole loan, due at the end of the month." It was a checkmate. Thorne wasn't just trying to ruin his name. He was trying to bankrupt him, to take everything he had built, legally, while the town looked the other way, too scared to intervene. Cole walked out of the bank into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. The street seemed different now. Every friendly face was now a potential enemy. Every closed door was a judgment. He was losing, badly. He went back to the boarding house. He had to tell Eliza. He had to tell her that this was bigger than Mace Carver, bigger than her, bigger than him. He found her in the small garden out back, tending to some wilting rose bushes. She looked up when he approached, a small smile on her face, a smile that faltered when she saw the look in his eyes. He told her everything, about Silas Thorne, about the bank, about the whole town being held hostage. He expected to see the fear return to her eyes. He expected her to crumble, but she didn't. She just listened, her expression becoming hard, determined. "Those papers," she said, her voice clear and strong, "the ones I saw Mace signing, they weren't just bills of sale for cattle." Cole frowned. "What do you mean?" "There was a map," she said, her eyes distant as she tried to remember. "A drawing on the back of one of the pages, and there was a symbol on it, a circle with a cross inside it. He kept stamping that symbol on the papers with an ink pad. A circle with a cross." Cold realization washed over Cole. He knew that symbol. It wasn't a cattle brand. It was an old surveyor's mark. His father had used it on his original maps of the Bar H. It marked the location of the hidden spring, the one deep in the back canyons that never ran dry, even in the worst droughts. That was what Thorne was really after, not just the land, the water, the lifeblood of the entire valley. And Eliza hadn't just seen a simple cattle rustling operation. She had stumbled upon the final stages of Thorne's plan to steal the most valuable resource in the entire territory. And those papers, they weren't just false sales. They were forged land claims. The new knowledge changed the board entirely. This wasn't just a defense anymore. They had to go on the offensive. Cole knew he couldn't trust the sheriff. He couldn't trust the town. There was only one person he could trust, and she was standing right in front of him. "That map," he said to Eliza, Do you remember anything else about it? She closed her eyes, concentrating. It was a map of your land. I saw the name, Bar H, the symbol, the circle with the cross. It was marked up in the North Canyon. There was a dotted line leading to it from the old abandoned silver mine. The old Monarch mine. It had been played out for decades. It bordered the north end of his property, and it connected directly to Silas Thorne's ranch on the other side of the ridge. Thorne wasn't planning on coming through the front gate. He was planning on tunneling through, diverting the spring water underground, stealing it right out from under Cole's feet. It was a brilliant, devious plan, and they had no way to prove it. They had no way to stop it. Unless, Cole looked at Eliza. An idea, a desperate, crazy idea began to form in his mind. If we could get our hands on those papers, he said slowly, the ones with the map and the forged claims, that would be all the proof we need. Proof even the sheriff couldn't ignore. But Mace has them, Eliza said. Or Thorne. And they'll have them hidden somewhere safe, Cole finished. Somewhere like Thorne's own ranch house. It was suicide. Riding onto the ranch of the most powerful man in the valley, a man who had already proven he was willing to burn and kill to get what he wanted. But it was the only move they had left to play. That night, under the cover of a moonless, star-dusted sky, they rode out of Dry Creek. They didn't take the main road. They took the high trails, the game paths that only Cole knew, winding their way through the dark, silent hills. They were no longer the hunted. They were the hunters. As they rode, Eliza told him more about herself. She wasn't just a drifter. She was an orphan, raised in a church home back east. She'd come west searching for any sign of the family she'd never known. Her parents had owned a small homestead in this valley, she'd been told, before they died in a fire when she was just a baby. All she had was a name, Hart. Cole listened, a growing sense of unease settling in his stomach. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. They reached the ridge overlooking Thorne's ranch just before dawn. It was a fortress, a main house made of stone and thick timber, with several bunkhouses and barns, all surrounded by a high fence. Lights burned in the windows of the main house. Thorne was awake. They tethered their horses in a thicket of juniper and crept closer on foot. Getting inside would be impossible, but maybe they didn't have to. Mace was always bragging, Eliza whispered, her breath making a small cloud in the cold air. He said Thorne gave him the old foreman's cottage to live in. Said it was better than the main house because no one bothered him there. The foreman's cottage was a small separate building, set off to the side near the corrals. It was dark. If the papers were anywhere, they'd be with Mace. It was still a long shot, but it was better than nothing. They slipped through a break in the fence, moving from shadow to shadow. The air was filled with the smell of horses and hay and the low sound of cattle shifting in their pens. They reached the cottage. The door was unlocked. Cole drew his Colt, the hammer clicking back with a soft, deadly sound. He pushed the door open, and they slipped inside. The cottage was small and filthy. It smelled of stale whiskey and unwashed clothes. A quick search of the main room turned up nothing. There was a small bedroom in the back. Cole pushed the door open, and that's when their luck ran out. Mace Carver was there. He was passed out on the bed, fully clothed, an empty whiskey bottle on the floor beside him. But he wasn't alone. Sloan was there too, sitting in a chair in the corner, a shotgun across his lap. He'd been asleep, but the sound of the door creaking open had woken him. His eyes snapped open, wide and startled. For a split second, nobody moved. It was a frozen tableau. Cole with his pistol raised, Eliza gasping behind him, and Sloan, his face a mask of panic as he fumbled to bring the shotgun up. Cole didn't hesitate. He fired. He didn't aim to kill. He aimed for the wall right next to Sloan's head. The roar of the Colt was deafening in the small room. Splinters of wood exploded from the wall. Sloan cried out and dropped the shotgun, throwing his hands up to cover his face. The noise shocked Mace out of his drunken stupor. He sat bolt upright in bed, his eyes wild and unfocused, trying to understand what was happening. Cole was on him in two strides, the barrel of his pistol pressed hard against Mace's forehead. "The papers, Mace," Cole growled, his voice low and dangerous. "The forged claims. Where are they?" Mace just stared, his mouth hanging open. But Eliza saw it, a small, locked metal box under the bed. There, she said, pointing. She scrambled past them, pulled the box out, and began searching the room for something to pry it open with. Sloane, seeing his chance, made a dive for the fallen shotgun, but he never made it. Eliza swung a heavy iron skillet she'd grabbed from the stove, catching him square in the side of the head. He went down like a sack of grain. At that moment, shouts erupted from outside. The gunshot had woken the whole ranch. Lights were coming on in the bunkhouses. Men were yelling. "We have to go," Cole said, grabbing Mace and hauling him to his feet, keeping the gun pressed to his temple. "Eliza, the box!" Eliza found a crowbar by the cold fireplace and slammed it into the lock. The metal shrieked and the lock broke. She threw the lid open. Inside was a stack of papers, and on top of them, a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. She grabbed the papers, stuffing them inside her shirt, but her eyes were fixed on the letters. She picked them up. On the top envelope was a name that made the blood drain from her face. John and Mary Hart, her parents. The shouting outside was getting closer. Doors were slamming. Boots were pounding on the hard-packed earth. "Eliza, now!" Cole yelled, dragging Mace toward the door. But Eliza was frozen, staring at the letters in her hand. "This was their land," she whispered, her voice filled with a dawning, horrified realization. "The Bar H. This was my parents' homestead. You stole it from them." The world tilted on its axis. Cole stared at her, then at the name on the envelope. Hart, John Hart. He remembered him now, a young homesteader, years ago. A good man. They'd been neighbors. And he remembered the fire, a terrible accident that had taken both John and his wife. Cole had bought the land fair and square from the county afterward. It had been abandoned. There were no known heirs. "It wasn't like that, Eliza," he stammered, his mind reeling. "There was a fire. I never knew you existed." But the look in her eyes was one of pure betrayal. At the worst possible moment, with an army of angry men about to descend on them, the woman he was trying to save now believed he was the man who had destroyed her family. The door burst open. Silas Thorne stood there, a rifle in his hands, his face a mask of cold fury. Behind him stood a dozen ranch hands, all armed. They were trapped, and they were out of time. "Well, Harding," Thorne said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "This is a surprise. I do hate it when vermin get into the house." He took in the scene. Sloane unconscious on the floor, Mace held at gunpoint, and Eliza clutching the letters, her face pale with shock and betrayal. Thorne's eyes flickered to the open metal box, then to the paper stuffed into Eliza's shirt. His smile widened. "It seems you found something that doesn't belong to you." "This is over, Thorne," Cole said, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at his heart. "We have the proof. Forged claims. A conspiracy to steal my water." Thorne laughed, a deep, ugly sound. "Your water? My dear Harding, you've been squatting on Hart family land for 20 years. That spring belongs to the rightful heir." He gestured with his rifle toward Eliza. Her. The betrayal was complete. This was Thorne's masterstroke. He hadn't just been trying to steal the land from Cole. He had found the long-lost heir, Eliza Hart, and had been manipulating her from the very beginning. He'd likely arranged for her to get the job at the ferry landing, knowing she'd eventually cross paths with Mace. The beating, the branding, it was all a monstrous theater, designed to make her hate and fear Cole Harding, to see him as the villain who had not only stolen her birthright, but had also brutalized her. He was positioning himself as her savior, the man who would help her reclaim her family's legacy. And once she had the land back in her name, a grateful, naive young woman would be easy to control, easy to swindle. He'd get the land and the water in the end, all under the cover of a heartwarming story of justice served. "You won't get away with this," Eliza said, her voice shaking but filled with a new fire. She was looking at Thorne now, the pieces clicking into place in her own mind. The way he had so easily offered her a job. The way Mace had seemed to be playing a part. "Oh, I think I will," Thorne said. "You see, no one is going to believe a hysterical girl and a disgraced rancher. They will, however, believe me. They'll believe the story of how Harding, in a desperate attempt to cover up his old crimes, broke into my home and kidnapped this poor, innocent orphan. He raised his rifle. Drop the gun, Harding. It's over. But Cole was looking past Thorne at the men behind him. They were ranch hands, not killers. Their faces were uncertain. They had signed on to work cattle, not to be part of a cold-blooded murder. He's lying to you, Cole said, his voice ringing with authority. This man, Silas Thorne, he hired Carver to brand this girl. He burned down the blacksmith shop. He's been manipulating all of you, just like he's been manipulating this town. Shut up, Thorne roared. Shoot him! But the men hesitated. A flicker of doubt had been planted, and in that moment of hesitation, a new voice cut through the tension. Drop the rifle, Thorne. Sheriff Amos Reed stepped out from behind the corner of the cottage, a shotgun leveled at Thorne's chest. Behind him were half a dozen deputies, their own guns raised. Thorne stared, his face a mixture of shock and fury. Reed, what is the meaning of this? I told you to wait for my signal. The sheriff's face was grim. I got tired of waiting. When I saw the smoke from the fire at Jasper's place, I knew this had gone too far. I knew you weren't just a bully, Thorne. You were a monster. I had my men watch this place all night. Reed's apparent weakness in town had been an act, a dangerous act to lull Thorne into a false sense of security, to make him believe he had the law in his pocket. He'd been playing a longer, deadlier game all along. The standoff was a three-way powder keg. Thorne's men were confused. Mace was a whimpering mess in Cole's grip, and Thorne himself was a cornered rat, his brilliant plan crumbling to dust around him. He swung his rifle toward the sheriff, but he was too slow. Two shots rang out, almost as one. The sheriff's shotgun roared, and Cole's Colt bucked in his hand. Thorne was thrown backward, a look of stunned surprise on his face before he crumpled to the ground. In the ringing silence that followed, Mace Carver sobbed and sank to his knees. The ranch hands dropped their weapons. It was finally over. In the days that followed, the whole ugly story came out. The forged papers, which Eliza had bravely held on to throughout the entire ordeal, were undeniable proof of Thorne's conspiracy. The letters she found confirmed her identity as the sole heir to the original Hart homestead, the land that had become the heart of the Bar H Ranch. Mace Carver and his partner Sloan, in exchange for lighter sentences, confessed everything. How Thorne had orchestrated the entire scheme, from the cattle rustling to the brutal branding. The town of Dry Creek, ashamed of its fear and suspicion, turned out to thank Cole. He was no longer an outcast, but a hero who had refused to back down. Sheriff Reed, his reputation restored, shook Cole's hand. I'm sorry I had to deceive you, Cole, he said. It was the only way to get close enough to Thorne to catch him in the act. One evening, a week later, Cole found Eliza down by the river again, in the same spot where their story had begun. She was looking out at the water, the setting sun turning her hair to gold. The land, the ranch, everything he had worked for his entire life, legally belonged to her now. You know, he said, his voice quiet as he stood beside her. You could tell me to leave. You'd have every right. Eliza turned to him, a small, sad smile on her lips. My parents' letters, she said. I read them. They wrote about their neighbor, a young man who helped them build their first cabin. A man they called a true friend. His name was Cole Harding. She looked at the vast expanse of land stretching out before them. This place was stolen from me by Silas Thorne, not by you. You just took care of it for me until I could come home. Cole felt a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying lift from his shoulders. He looked at this remarkable young woman who had endured so much and had come out the other side not with bitterness, but with grace. What will you do now? He asked. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and steady. I think, she said, I'm going to need a good foreman to help me run this place. Stories like this, they're about more than just gunsmoke and justice. They're about the choices we make when everything is on the line. Do we run from the fire or do we run toward it? Cole Harding and Eliza Hart both had every reason to give up, to let the darkness win. But they didn't. They chose the harder path. They chose to fight. And in doing so, they didn't just save a ranch, they built a future. If their story of courage and resilience moved you, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. That way you'll never miss another tale where the lines between good and evil get blurred, and ordinary people are forced to do extraordinary things. So let me ask you this. When you're faced with your own riverbank, your own moment of truth, do you ride on by, or do you stop and lend a hand no matter the cost? Think about it, because the story you tell with your life is the only one that truly matters.